Welcome back to the February report. Today we're going to talk about the record supply of new apartments coming online, BILT's recent valuation, rent reporting and how it ties into credit scores, the dramatic spike other markets are seeing in fraud cases. We have to talk about our forum a little bit because I'm super excited about that one. And finally, the recap of NMHC's annual that just wrapped up last week. So let's get right into it, and let's start with the last one. Tyler, you just got back fairly recently. I'd love to hear what the blue suits were really talking about in San Diego this year.
Yeah, a lot of blue suits. Loved seeing more pink. There were more, and that's not just funnel. I wore a blue suit actually, but a little better female representation this year, so hopefully that continues. But yeah, I think that what people are afraid of are not hard times, and we're still in for hard times in multifamily. What people are afraid of, and when you get kind of despair, is the proverbial falling knife, when you don't know if you've hit the bottom yet. And there seemed to be more optimism this year at NMHC Annual that to me was a reflection of, yes, rates are high, they are staying high, but we know what we're dealing with. We know the challenges, including, I know we're going to talk about the number of new apartments coming onto the market, but that's a known risk. And I think when I think about the last couple of annuals, it was clear that rates were going to be increasing and there was going to be a negative impact, and some of the other variables like insurance costs, those were just, we knew they was going to get worse, but we didn't know how much worse. So all that being said, to me, there was a real great energy in the room. There was a lot of folks wanting to do deals, and I think we're going to see that play out through 2024. Not surprising that one of the big stories last week was the Greystar Wood acquisition / partnership merger. And so I think there'll be more deal making going on. The meetings that I saw were packed. There was a lot of folks coming in and trying to find their way to put capital to work.
Tyler, you mentioned that Greystar is going to be taking over Wood's portfolio. I know there was a very interesting number in that press release that we all were excited about, but it seems like there is a steady cadence of some of the biggest soon-to-be million unit managers coming online here. What are some other changes you're seeing with third-party managers and how that reflects what NMHC Annual folks are talking about?
Yeah, Alex. Well, so first of all, there's a lot of rumors going around at NMHC Annual, and I certainly feel for any of the marketing or PR folks that were trying to keep that under wraps, because word started getting out and then it spread like wildfire. And by the end of the day, Thursday, people were posting their take on LinkedIn of what it meant. It wasn't until I think late Friday that we actually got official word that Greystar was taking over the management of the Wood-owned assets. So congrats to both of those teams. Great people at both organizations. Wood is primarily known, throughout the country, but really as one of the premier developers is what a lot of folks know Wood for. So they've done their part in bringing a lot of supply to the market, and I believe they'll continue to do that. They have an exclusive agreement with Greystar going forward. But the big headline that was kind of snuck in there was that in taking over management of these roughly 30,000 units, the Greystar is now a 895,000 unit manager, which is just an astronomical number. Last year's NMHC top 50 list had them at 700,000 or somewhere in that range. And so the growth that they're having is just unheard of. And I personally remember, I think it was circa 2013, when Greystar first merged with Riverstone. And that was really like ground-shaking, earth-shattering news back in the day. And to put it in perspective, I think that the combined entities were probably less than 250,000 units. And we legitimately had conversations of, is this going to be allowed? Is this, should you have two companies that big? But I bring that up in the context of what's happening at NMHC Annual and in the industry of headwinds create opportunity, but they also create more competition because there's less margin to go around. And so economies of scale are going to be incredibly important, because if I'm an asset manager, I am super sensitive to my fees. And so if I can partner with a Greystar or an RPM or one of these, Asset recently came out and they said they have 280,000 units under management, which again shocked us. I didn't know they were nearly that big. So I'm going to be looking and pressuring those organizations, and they have the wherewithal to provide best-in-class services and buy a light bulb a heck of a lot cheaper than the smaller operators. So certainly don't think it means the death of all small operators, because if there's 20 million professionally managed apartments in this country, I think we're headed to a world with mega managers of million-unit portfolios. But even if you have 4 or 5 of those, there's still $15 million units to be had. And obviously, we hope the market continues to grow beyond that. But yeah, big news. I don't think it's going to be long at this pace before we see our first ever million unit manager. It'd be very hard at this point for anybody other than Greystar to get there first, but I don't think they'd be the last either.
I had to look it up when you dated yourself there. It was even more recent than 2013. It was 2015 when they merged, so pretty quick.
Wow. Yeah.
Numbers in there.
That is crazy when you put it in that context.
Let's talk about some of those new record-breaking numbers of units coming on. So according to a Fast Company article, this will be the biggest influx of multifamily housing supply since the Nixon era. Last year, 439,000 apartments came online or were completed, highest numbers since 1987. This year, they're estimating 671,000 plus. So nearly 230K more. Tyler, we've talked about this being overall a good thing for renters, affordability. You have more supply, of course, that's good for them. What are operators thinking about in 2024 with this huge record-breaking number of units coming online?
Yeah, great point. So there's a lot to unpack here. First and foremost, Alex, you are right that this is good for renters, right? And good for the industry. We do not want rent control. Nobody who's listened to this podcast is a fan of rent control. And the answer for sustainable growth is supply, right? And so love seeing, and we can point to, in future years when people say, hey, we have to get rent control, we need to point to this year and say, in 2023, we put 400,000 units in the market. In 2024, we put 600, a million units in 2 years is great. But if you listen to any housing institute, they'll tell you we need to keep that average pace of 400,000 to 600,000 units a year for the next decade just to keep pace with supply. So again, this is good news. Now, but what does it mean from an operator's perspective? It's competition. And I alluded to this earlier. The difference with rates increasing and units coming onto the market, rates increasing doesn't immediately affect what I can ask in rent because, my renters don't pay interest on their rent. And so that's not necessarily pushing demand down. This does affect supply and demand because that increase of supply into the market means that you're competing more for the demand. So that's obvious, but I think what's important is that we know where the units are coming on board. So if I'm an operator in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I know, or I could just go drive around and see the cranes, and I know where those new apartments are coming. And so it is certainly leading to increased urgency around new operating models, right? That I'm going to have to be more efficient because if my costs are going up still, which they are, but rents are going to be flat because of the increased supply. I got an email this morning from one of our clients that I'm on their mailing list of, and these are A-plus properties in downtown Atlanta, $1,000 concessions, right? And that was unheard of a couple of years ago. But they're doing that because they want to keep their 95% occupancy up, right? And we want to make sure that we don't have really bad vacancy rates. And so in that world in which I have to give concessions or my rents are flat, the only way for me to continue to deliver a return to my asset managers, my investors, is for me to get more efficient on the operating side. So I certainly know here at Funnel, we're seeing an increased focus on operational efficiencies and the ROI of different tools. But yeah, I think it's the new normal that as all these apartments come onto the market, operators are just going to have to be more aggressive because lowering rents is a very short-term strategy just to keep occupancy up. And then last thing, Alex, I do think is important to note, this is where interest rates do play a interesting part, is that when interest rates have gone up over the last 18 months, that in itself didn't cool the demand, right? It was more so all the supply from previous years. The problem here is that the increased rates have completely slowed down the development. And so these record numbers of new units we see coming onto the market are going to drop off precipitously in the next several years. The bad news is that means for renters, rents are going to be going back up dramatically because supply and demand is going to get out of whack again. And so hopefully this is, we don't advocate for any specific policies on this podcast, but I do hope that the powers that be take notice of that while raising interest rates is the right move to cool off inflation and largely has helped us towards something like a soft landing, the negative impact that we have not thought through, you mentioned, this is the most apartment units since was it Nixon administration, right? We also need to think through politically, how do we not negatively impact housing supply? Because that's going to turn around. If rents are going up 15, 20% year over year again, inflation's back. Even if gas sticks at $3, inflation will be back if rents are increasing that much. So we're in a bit of a quagmire right now in that regard.
$3 sounds pretty nice to those of us in California.
Sorry, I didn't mean to rub that in.
Let's talk about the recent BILT news. Our friends over at BILT just doubled their valuation, $3 billion by this latest $200 million round. I have a sense of where some of that money is getting spent. If you spend any time on Reddit or TikTok, you will see a BILT ad popping up. But clearly showing a lot of enthusiasm in the VC world for how customers, how consumers are buying today. They want to pay with a credit card, earn loyalty rewards, and hopefully build a little bit of a credit history in the process. What does that bullish round mean for you and the future of multifamily loyalty?
Great question. Yeah, congrats to our friends at BILT. We're big fans. We have quasi-competitive areas of our business, but we are huge fans of the disruption that they're bringing to the space. We've talked in the past on this pod about, Yardi taking note and eliminating ACH fees. We've noticed other organizations doing free rent reporting. Those are all things that BILT isn't alone in doing, but they certainly have pushed harder than anybody. And I think the big lesson here that's really motivating for all of us as housing advocates and especially as entrepreneurs is that when there is a big, fat, high margin product that hasn't been innovated in decades, that spells opportunity. Because let's really zone in on what's happening here. You look at our partners, Yardi, RealPage, Entrata, even Appfolio. These companies' financials are not completely secret. Several of them are public or have been public. So anywhere from 30 to 50% of the revenues of those multi-billion-dollar organizations come from payment processing fees. And these are really high payment processing fees when you compare them to what it costs. We talked about gas, which it is about $3.09 down the road here in Tampa. I swipe my card and I'm not getting hit with these, crazy fees. But for some reason in paying rent, we got okay with that. We were comfortable with it because ACH was low. And so if I'm paying with a credit card, I guess that just is what it is. And, credit to the team at BILT. They saw that opportunity and said, we're going to go attack that. And we're going to have to offer a more aggressive package. We're going to have lower margins. But at the end of the day, the opportunity was there. And I think when I talk to our partners who use BILT, these are large organizations who are using it at scale, they view it as a win-win. They view it as an additional amenity that they can offer to their residents. And they weren't making money on payment processing to begin with, right? So there's not like, these large operators are giving up anything, that's hurting their ability to drive a profit. They're just kind of taking away from the legacy model of subsidizing software costs by charging transactional fees. So again, I don't know exactly where it goes. I think there's a lot of question marks still about, you just mentioned raising all this money. And it's true of, you think about Uber or Amazon, a lot of these products in the early days were not profitable business models. And over time they had to shift a little bit. Now Uber comes with ads, but their costs are a little bit higher, but they're now a profitable organization. So I don't have a crystal ball to know exactly where BILT ends up, but I think what they're doing for the industry is a phenomenal service. And most importantly, in my mind, it pushes us more towards a world of loyalty and rewards, which if a third of Americans are renters and they're not able to build equity through rent, I love the idea that they're able to build some sort of lifetime relationship or value add relationship while they pay rent.
Agreed. There was a New York Times article about the plethora of new ways to add rental payments to your credit score, right? As you mentioned, a third of Americans are renting today. A lot of them are just leaving money or loyalty or some kind of proof that they're doing it the right way on the table. The statistic I had seen was less than 5% of the roughly 80 million adults who rent have rental data in their files. And what was most often reported are, unfortunately, the negative payments, missed payments. The idea behind it is if you can demonstrate an on-time pattern, you're going to reduce some disparities in homeownership, right? Do you think it's a good thing for renters that they can generally add their on-time or sometimes missed payments? Or is it going to further disadvantage renters who are just right on the edge of housing affordability?
Yeah, great question and a lot to unpack here. So let me be direct first and say rent reporting, the movement towards more renters having the ability to report their rent and build their credit is wonderful news. Directionally is exactly what we want. The nuance comes in and how we go about getting there. So first and foremost, you mentioned the disparity between the number of renters in America, which is 30+%. I think it's now approaching 38% of the households are rental households. and the 5% that have it show up on their credit report. And the 5%, let's keep in mind, that's likely because they were sent to collections, right? So it's not that the management company was doing that. It's probably that those were the folks that unfortunately ended up needing to be evicted in many cases. There's edge cases. And to that, then you mentioned, should we be reporting positive, negative? The vast majority of providers that I'm familiar with only, and this is what I would support this position, only support positive rent payments because it is not a line of credit, right? And so it should be treated differently. Where if I'm going to get a line of credit from my home, home equity line of credit, I'm signing up. I recognize that the consequences are they will report back good or bad. But it should only be positive rent reporting because it's a different relationship financially. But it should not be 5% of renters, right? We should be talking about, or 5% of the American households. It should be far higher than that are getting it. One of the other things that we've talked a lot about on LinkedIn and other places, and we'll continue to talk about, is that like many services, what should be an optional value add service, unfortunately by some in our industry, has been used as a tool for revenue generation unbeknownst to the renter themselves. And so what I'm talking about is junk fees, hiding rent reporting fees in a lease. Even if the renter happens to read their lease, they're at the point in time in which they've already given notice, they've already paid an application fee. It is unlikely that they will have the ability to find other housing or choose to do so. And so we're big fans of rent reporting. And I personally, I started my career actually in credit repair. I'm passionate about the subject. And I rented. I always would have loved the option to be able to build my credit while renting. Very few times did I actually have the choice. There was one time specifically, though, and it was perfect. Progress Residential, I'll give them big credit. I was renting with them, and it was very clear to me that it was a choice, that I could choose to report my rent, but it was not forced upon me. And it was expensive. It happened that I didn't need it at that point in time, so I didn't pay for it, but I was informed. So I think directionally, again, it's great that rent reporting is becoming more and more prominent. More and more companies are offering it for free. We should also make sure that it's optional. And yeah, it should only be positive rent reporting because if somebody doesn't pay their rent and they need to be evicted, then the collections process will take care of the negative impact that those folks will have attained.
Let's talk about fraud. There was a recent Globe Street article about how much fraud is really costing landlords across the country. NMHC did a survey that ended, I believe, just in January of this year. 93% of respondents said that these are owners and managers. They'd experienced fraud in the past year, roughly 40% higher than last year. Fraudulent applications and the failure to pay was roughly 24% of eviction. To your point, these things take care of themselves. It's largely still concentrated in Atlanta, which we've heard a number of times, but now more so in Texas, Florida, some of these in enormous states. At Apartmentalized last year, that was when I think we heard the most about fraud. It was in Atlanta, but things seem to be spreading a bit. What do you make of this for the future of 2024? Are we going to see this everywhere or still just concentrated in a few key markets?
And I think we should start by saying that fraud hurts everyone, right? Because the vast majority of renters who are good actors end up paying the burden of the bad debt that was incurred by fraudulent actors. And what you'll hear from operators is that the majority of those evictions that unfortunately come to be, they're not folks who lost their job and came on hard times, although that may happen. Far more often is it somebody who never intended to pay and they were falsifying information from the get-go. And so this is a problem that should be solved, or we should try to solve the best that we can. But I think the numbers that you're talking about, in my perspective, from talking with lots of operators and lots of our clients, it is not one size fits all. It really varies by market. And I do think that the crisis, the fraud crisis that we were seeing was localized and was a symptom of housing affordability really being unattainable, right? So when you in the Sun Belt, the same markets you just talked about, Alex, that time frame that we're talking about was when across the Sun Belt, we were seeing rents increase double digits. And that does not justify the fraud, but it creates a dynamic in which nobody can afford to rent and bad actors really see an opportunity. The story you always hear in Atlanta is you drive around town and you see little signs that say, fake ID, fake income, send me a message. Became common practice. Atlanta, Houston were the most hard hit. But a lot of our partners, fraud is not even a top 5 issue for them. It doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean bad debt doesn't exist. But it is not the crisis that it was for folks in those markets. And so I also think that if we look ahead and assume over the next year that rents are generally flat across the country because of the number of new units coming on, I think we'll hear less about fraud. And that's kind of a bold prediction. And it doesn't mean it's going away. But I do think that the supply-demand issues are making housing a little bit more affordable. And we're still at record highs. So I'm not saying this is, but it is not growing in the way it was. And then last point I'll make, and this is, not a commercial for funnel because there's also lots of other providers to do this, but the tooling, the ability to catch fraud has caught up a little bit to some of those bad actors. Now, they're always going to constantly evolve. If you stop them here, they'll try to get in somewhere else. But it is much harder now. So a lot of the places like Houston, like Atlanta, that were in full crisis mode with this fraud, most operators have adopted new processes to try and fight back on the bad documentation that was coming through. So fraud is certainly something we as an industry need to continue to fight. We need to take advantage of the great technology tools that are now available. But my prediction is that it will be less of a headline issue. And let's put it this way. NAA in Atlanta, one of the top 2-3 issues we were talking about coming out of there. Fraud was everything everybody was talking about because of the market and because of the rents. My prediction for you is that in Philadelphia this year, it will be talked about, but I'm guessing it probably will have moved out of the top 5 pressing issues that operators are looking at that point in time, because we're going to be more concerned about, trying to keep the lights on with flat rent growth.
Tyler, since we last recorded the report, these national class action suits seem to be moving forward. There have been a number of kind of smaller developments, and it's also having a lot of interest in the mainstream press. So we're reading about these things all the time. What do you make of the latest developments and where things are going?
Yeah, Alex, it's been very interesting to see our industry be talked about in the New York Times, talked about on MSNBC, and you're right that there was a big ruling by Judge Crenshaw out of Tennessee saying that he was supporting moving ahead with these, and the DOJ filed in support of it. And so I think what is really interesting to me as a pro multifamily housing advocate and somebody who also believes in revenue management writ large is that it's creating, in my opinion, a much more intelligent conversation around pricing and around our responsibility as housing providers. And I am happy to see that. Specifically, I saw coverage where they were focusing in on the DC lawsuit, which is similar to many of the others, but they're specifically going after the percentage of units that were using the YieldStar product in the DC area. And, the Attorney General specifically says in the interview, we want to see them stop doing this practice. And he didn't say the practice of revenue management. He was really talking about, and the judge, including in the ruling, was being very smart and nuanced about what pieces of the technology they had a problem with, right? And primarily that was using proprietary lease transaction data. And they said, nobody's disputing this. Nobody's disputing this part. You're disputing other pieces of the argument. And so my opinion is that the conversation will continue to be an intelligent, nuanced conversation. And the result, therefore, will be that we as an industry evolve, right? I don't think revenue management is going to go away. When you have a big industry like we do, tens of millions of apartment units, it makes sense to use tools and it makes sense to use AI. AI is in everything that we do. I just bought a flight to Austin right now. I guarantee you there's not somebody sitting coming up with a price, right? There's an algorithm coming up with that price. It's more efficient, better for me as a consumer. The optionality is all there. But establishing more guidelines, I think, is where it seems to be going. As the conversation just started with words like cartel that were not fair to anybody, and now it's getting more focused in on specific practices. I am fascinated to watch how this evolves. I believe that RealPage has a big response due in the next month or so, and I'm sure they're continuing to drive an intelligent conversation around this. But again, my take is that we're going to see it move in towards a world in which we're focusing more on which specific pieces of revenue management practices we don't want moving forward as an industry.
Hard to imagine also the timing isn't somewhat related to those dramatic spikes in rent growth we saw during COVID, and it happens to be a pretty big election year. These are things that people tend to talk about a lot.
Yeah, well, and one of the counter arguments that is really salient from the defendants is that, well, if we were responsible for the rent increases, are you saying we're responsible for the rent decreases that are now happening? And I think it's a pretty strong argument that no one operator or collection of operators has that much pricing power, which is kind of the primary argument you'll hear from folks against this lawsuit. But yeah, you're right. I think the political environment being what it is, it's not good. We're going to hear more and more about it. And again, I think that the outcome will be a win-win for everybody.
Let's talk about the forum. I know we're both excited about it. I met you at Terranea last week, the venue for our upcoming inaugural event. We've now got over 60 of the top names, logos, truly some of the most impressive people in multifamily registered. We have about 20 spots left. What are you most excited about?
The off-the-script conversation. So you and I, Alex, obviously spend our time with Hannah, our fabulous producer, talking about, the content and who's going to be on which panel. I've been to enough of these similar events that what is most invigorating are the impromptu conversations after the panel where, hey, you mentioned this. Can you tell me more about that? And when you look at that with the attendee list of the best executives at some of the largest, most innovative organizations in multifamily, I am super excited for those conversations. Just sitting by the fire, looking at the ocean, talking about centralization. I mean, that's like my dream come true, right? What could be better? So I'm very excited for all the conversations that'll be had. And yeah, spots are filling up. I mean, we're down to just 20 or so spots left. So hopefully if you're listening, you can jump on and join us.
And that is from today, Monday, February 5th. So whenever this comes out, probably fewer. Please do jump on that. Okay, I'm going to read the first submitted question from one of our podcast listeners. Hi, my name is, we're going to blank that out. I'm based in Seattle, work in the multifamily industry. I hear from operators about fraud a lot and how they feel stuck on the best way to solve it. Agents are often spending hours of their week manually verifying income and identity. Bad actors have gotten very good at creating convincing documents. They often can't tell the difference. What are some best practices you've seen others use?
Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. And this is one of the areas that if I were to switch seats and put my operator hat on, I would be pretty excited about, because this is not one size fits all at all. We have partners who are simply looking at credit and identity to folks who are using an entire battery of tools. I mean, there's modern technology that can look at a document and identify if it's fraudulent. They can sync with your bank account. They can sync with your pay stubs and validate all of that. And what tools you put in place very much depends on your portfolio, your demographic of renter, and frankly, the ease at which you want to assume new renters. So, my perspective is first and foremost, get acquainted with the modern technology. A lot of older operators, and not older as in years, but older as in practice, are very accustomed to the way that we screen for renters today, and are surprised to find out that the vast majority of renters, they want to apply on a mobile device. They're comfortable sharing their banking information and would happily provide you with that. And so make yourself familiar with all the modern technology that's available for screening, for fraud prevention. But then you're going to have to experiment a little. Obviously as a technology company, we love standardization, but I'll be honest, I think this is an area that if I had a portfolio, I'd be A/B testing, right? And the good thing is with fraud, this shows up in real data. Bad debt is a real hard number. So, it's hard sometimes in marketing. I'm sitting here with Alex to know exactly which marketing dollar led to which lead. But when it comes to fraud prevention and screening, there's ways to show up and look empirically and say, we had this slate of tools that led to this bad debt versus that. And I think in our experience, you're going to see really positive results, but there is not one approach that fits every portfolio, because, you could use every possible tool, but that may not be the right fit for you, because you may be at a property where you're sending leads to your competition down the street, and you were just making it more difficult, and bad debt wasn't really the problem. So you got to look at it holistically for your revenue goals. But make yourself familiar with all the tools that are available to you today.
Perfect. Tyler, thank you for joining me. We will catch everyone in March. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.